Well, first I have to start off with an apology. I hadn't realized that before DC you all had gone to Torrey Pines and Napa Valley and other lovely places like San Diego. Here, get this going. Obviously it's a cold, rainy day in Washington, DC, and you have to listen to policymakers. And I really can't think of any way to say it other than I'm sorry from the depths of my heart. Also, I wanted to say thank you to Pat, to Bernard, to all of the executive team here at OSI. What you do to those of us who are policymakers is magic. It's just the same as pulling a rabbit out of a hat. The engineers of the world, my grandfather was an engineer. He worked on getting airplanes to vibrate less during World War II. And to those of us who are in the policy world, we see what you do as the backbone of our country and as what is going to move us forward into the next century and through the rest of this one. Every time this country has moved in a major direction, it's been because of engineers. When I was driving this summer for my summer vacation, I drove from Alaska down to Colorado and was listening to books on tape. And one of the books I was listening to was Einstein, about the physicist, and the other was about the Transcontinental Railroad and the building of the railroad, the great engineering feat of the 19th century. And arguably, engineers were behind that, and now they're behind the great engineering feats of the 20th century, the dams, the electricity that we managed to move across the entirety of our country right after the Great Depression. And now you're behind the greatest feat of the 21st century, bringing the sensors, bringing the internet, bringing the smart grid into being. So thank you for all of the work that you're all doing. My job here is to really talk a little bit about policy, politics, and national security. My own background is from the policy world. I'm a think tank person. I think a lot. I went to Oxford. I went to Yale. I'm supposed to be smart about this stuff. And now I run an organization that trains policymakers, politicians, and so on to understand these issues. We train about 200 congressional staff a year. Just yesterday, we trained every single Democratic challenger for Congress. Hopefully, we'll do the Republicans later on. We'll do the Senate in November. So we do a lot of trying to educate the policymakers and the political leaders. And then we do a lot of work with veterans and the military and the DOD, because energy particularly is a big issue for them, and obviously national security in general is very important. And what that means is that I cross the three tribes of Washington, D.C. The political folks, we call them the hacks, the policymakers, who we call the wonks, and the military, who we call the troops. And the Truman Project that I run is all about bringing the hacks, the wonks, and the troops onto the same page so that they're looking at the world from the same place. And that is stunningly difficult to do. We're all problem solvers here, you as engineers and myself as a policymaker. But today we're going to look at admiring a problem, which is what those of us in the policy world spend a lot of time doing. We admire the problem before we actually try to solve it. You should also know that I come from the Republic of Boulder now. I just flew over here yesterday morning in the midst of a foot of snow. And that means that energy is on my mind a lot. As you probably know, Boulder is one of the places where they're doing demonstration pilot projects on the smart grid. You've got a lot of energy folks working there all the time. So it's an exciting place to be. Energy is an issue of jobs, it's an issue of technology, and it's an issue of security. And different parts of Washington focus on different parts of these issues. But we're going to hone in on security. And I'm going to talk first about the fuel system, since fuel is mostly fueled by oil, about 94% oil, and then about electricity, which is about half coal, of course, and then a mix of other things, nuclear and gas. When you look at the fuel system of our country, the first thing that strikes you from a security perspective is supply chain bottlenecks. So you look at Turkey, you look at the Straits of Hormuz, you look at very narrow places where terrorists or an accident could sink a tanker, and all of a sudden you would not be moving oil through the world. There's a group here called SAFE, Securing America's Future Energy, that has a whole war game with all sorts of glitz and glamour that they do for policymakers here, where a terrorist group sinks a tanker right in the Straits of Hormuz, and suddenly all sorts of craziness happens with the oil system. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. But there's a lot of other insecurity in the fuel system. First of all, Al-Qaeda had already declared that this was their number one goal of attack, was fuel system, pipelines, and so on, the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure. And of course, it's very open. It's a very soft target, as we say. Lots of pipelines, lots of space that's unguarded, lots of plants all over the world. And so there's been a lot of work hardening these. The Saudis have had numerous attempts to hit their pipeline infrastructure, and we worry about that. 43% of our oil comes from countries where the State Department has a travel advisory warning. That includes Mexico, but it's a problem. And America has less than 5% of the total reserves, even if we tap all of my home state, Alaska. And so these are all issues. But with the oil market, we security folks don't solely focus on where it comes from, because in a lot of ways it doesn't really matter. Oil's a global commodity. The price is set on the global markets. Even if we're buying it from Canada, we're affecting the global market price. And what that means is that every time we buy oil, and we're 25% of the market for oil, every time we as America buy oil, we jack up the price around the world, including in Iran, where we have a ban on buying oil. So in 2008, when oil prices spiked, Iran got 60% of its GDP from oil. That means that we are inadvertently directly fueling Iran's nuclear program. This worries us security folks. Every $5 that the price of oil goes up, $8 billion goes to Iran. A great deal of money goes to Russia. Russia also has a very energy-intensive economy. Now, of course, there are a couple different prices for oil. It's the price of heavy crude versus light crude and so on. But generally speaking, this is a large problem for the use of oil in our country. There's also a problem of terrorism. We get oil from countries like Saudi Arabia, countries that are allies of ours. But some of that money that gets into private hands is getting into terrorist hands, and it doesn't take a whole lot. Terrorist action is very cheap, actually. Richard Holbrooke, the former Richard Holbrooke, who was the czar of the Afghan-Pakistan situation, and really an incredible diplomat, one of the last things he did right before his death was started to draw the lines between oil money and terrorist financing and showing how it was worked. Nobody wanted to talk about this because Saudi Arabia is an ally of ours. That's where a lot of the money is flowing from. And it's flowing through private hands, and some of those private hands are connected to the royal family. It's a very large royal family. And so it's something that's very uncomfortable to talk about. But I should have started off by saying, this is off the record. I was raised by wolves in Alaska, and I tend to be blunt. But please, it's off the record. I've spent time in Saudi Arabia. I would like to be able to go back. So this is a problem, that our own money is fueling terrorism. The former director of the CIA, Jim Woolsey, who I've done some work with and written with, says this is the first war, this war on terror, first war since the Civil War, where we're funding both sides. And think about that. Here we're spending billions of dollars a year. We're impoverishing our own country, fighting this war on terror, and yet we're also paying for the people on the other side of it to fight us. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And those of us in the security realm start thinking, well, gosh, what do we do to move away from oil? There's also another problem with oil, which is the deep connection between dictatorship and oil. There's a lot of research on this. West Point did the most recent studies on it. And what they found is that the vast majority of countries where oil is making up most of their GDP, more than 60% of the GDP, are dictatorships. There's a lot of reasons for this. You have a natural resource that you can extract. That means that a government can get rents very easily. They don't need a tax base necessarily. A lot of the countries that rely on oil for most of their GDP don't need to tax their citizens. Well, we might all hate paying taxes, but if you don't pay any taxes, then your government really doesn't need to do much for you because there's not that reciprocal relationship. I live in Alaska. I can speak to this very, very well. We don't pay taxes. There's no income tax in Alaska. The government doesn't do a whole lot there. We don't have garbage collection. We don't have public water in a lot of the state. A whole bunch of things don't get done because there's not that reciprocal relationship. It's even more so in a lot of other countries. The dictatorships that oil spawn might seem like just a human rights issue, but in fact, another study West Point did was looking at the root causes of terrorism. Now, there's been a lot of talk about what causes terrorism. Is it caused by poverty? Is it caused by ideology? Is it caused by family recruiting networks? Well, a little bit of all of these things seems to be true, but the strongest correlation is actually with dictatorship. Much more so than poverty, much more so than even just ideology, is this combustible mix of ideology plus dictatorship plus poverty, with dictatorship being the strongest correlated variable. And that actually makes some sense. What happens is people don't have the ability to speak, right? There's no way to voice your concerns in a peaceful way. So groups become violent. Some little fringe group becomes violent. They're angry about something. The government, being a dictatorship, tends to crack down on that group. They crack down too hard. More people become angry. The group grows. Now you have a bigger group that's angry. The dictatorship grows and it's pushing down of that problem. And you get a vicious cycle that grows and grows. And that's how you get a lot of terrorist activity around the world. That, combined with the Al-Qaeda ideology, is part of what we're dealing with. That, combined with oil money, means that dictatorship, real problem, oil is fueling it. And those of us in the security field start saying, well, gosh, how do we turn oil into something that is not fueling our economy? Because right now, 94% of our transportation is fueled on oil. We don't want to slow that down. Our security also rests on economic security. No country that has not been a strong, strong economy has been a great power in this world. So how do we get economic security? How do we get economic growth while cutting down our oil so that we're not fueling all the problems that are coming back to bite us, that are costing us on the economic side, as well as on the side of the lives of our soldiers and troops overseas? So that's the fuel economy. Then, of course, there's also, and I should add here that some people then say, well, let's just buy it locally. Let's have local oil. Let's drill locally. Of course, we don't have enough here. And then other people say ethanol is the answer. At the Truman Project, at least, we don't think ethanol is the answer, because ethanol then jumps into throwing you from the frying pan into the fire, because ethanol is an extremely inefficient fuel. The amount that you get for the amount that you put in does not work out very well, mathematically speaking. I leave this to you engineers, but from what I can look at when I see the numbers. And that throws you into the issue of climate change. Well, why should we care about climate change? I'm a security person. I do come from Alaska, so I have seen that our snow is decreasing every year up there. But why does the security world care about this? Isn't this just an issue for the Birkenstock crowd in Boulder, Colorado that wants to cause problems? Well, actually, the CIA has now created a Center for Climate Change, and they're studying it. They have a satellite that's actually studying the polar ice caps because they're worried that Russia will be coming through that polar ice cap. We'll be looking at the northern passage, and that can cause all sorts of problems for who controls the seas, who can get where militarily more quickly. Russia's already put a flag down there near the North Pole claiming that it's theirs. So the CIA is quite worried about climate change. The DoD is also worried about climate change. They also have an office for climate change. Well, why is that? What's the strategic issue with climate change? A number of things. First of all, a lot of people in the security community look at climate change as a threat multiplier. It's not causing the threats, but it is causing a multiplication effect that metastasizes them into something much more dangerous, much more frightening and problematic. So look at countries like Bangladesh. Bangladesh, it's a delta country, largely underwater, heavily Muslim country, extremely poor. While they're not really a dictatorship, I did election monitoring over in Bangladesh. They're officially a democracy, but it's an extremely corrupt democracy. And they have real problems, and Al-Qaeda's been doing recruiting in Bangladesh. Pakistan, we all know about. Pakistan, huge problems with terrorism in Pakistan, huge problems with recruiting. It's where the Taliban are coming from that are fighting us in Afghanistan. Pakistan's a nuclear-armed country. Well, guess what? Climate change is heavily affecting those regions of the world. Bangladesh is likely to be underwater if it continues. What does that do? It throws refugees into India, which is right next door. Well, India's already erected a fence. They're not waiting to see 100% science. They've already erected a fence to keep out Bangladeshi refugees. And they're shooting refugees who are trying to come across the border right now. Hundreds a year. Well, as that number increases, do Do you get a war between Bangladesh and India, a Hindu country and a Muslim country? Do you get a tense situation between a nuclear-armed country and a country that has friends in high places in the rest of the Middle East? You could. That would not be good. On the Pakistan side, a fifth of Pakistan was underwater last year. What happens when a country goes underwater like that? Well, a lot of people are killed. A lot of bad things happen to individuals. But the first people on the ground helping those people are not the U.S. Marines. We did send people out there, but it takes a while to get people from here to there. The first people on the ground helping them, just like here, are church groups, except that some of their church groups are terrorist groups. Not all of them, by any means, but some of them. And they particularly like to exploit natural disasters and tragedies so that they can provide charity, help, education, and so on, and then bring people into their ideology. So the madrasas and so on set up, and people are destabilized from their normal lives. They're accepting this help, and then they're brought into an ideological world that causes us trouble. And this has become a huge problem in Pakistan. As severe weather events continue, particularly in that part of the world, we'll see more and more destabilized people searching for help and also feeling the need for some kind of answers, right? Some kind of theocratic or metaphysical answers. That's going to cause us more and more problems, because the problem with terrorism that we're fighting is not primarily a guns and bullets problem, it's a hearts and minds problem. It's what's going on in the hearts of people. And people who are destabilized, who are feeling at a loss, who are looking for something, some kind of meaning, are more likely to move toward a more fundamentalist ideology that causes us trouble. It's also a threat multiplier in parts of Africa. So it's no surprise that if you look in Africa, most of the problems that we're having are along a single line of latitude. It's called the Sudano-Sahel line. And it goes through Mali, it goes through Ethiopia, it goes through parts of Somalia. It's a line that goes right through there, happens to be a line of desertification, a place where things are getting drier and drier. The arable land is getting less and less. Climate change is exacerbating that, causing more desertification. Well, what happens? You have resource wars. You have resource wars in the Sudan. They were one of the exacerbating factors in the Sudanese genocide. You have resource wars in Somalia. You have a huge famine going on right now in the Horn of Africa right now. Over 800,000 people starving. Well, climate change is exacerbating that. And then it links up with other issues that are going on. It links up with terrorist ideology. It links up with countries fighting other countries. It links up with tribes fighting other tribes. And suddenly you have a whole realm of destabilized area running right through countries like Nigeria, which is one of the places where we get most of our oil. A large percentage comes from Nigeria, running right through countries where Al-Qaeda has bulkheads like Somalia. And suddenly we have to respond. And you might say we shouldn't respond. Why don't we stick to our knitting and stay closer to home? But the reality is we're still the superpower in the world. We're going to respond because we need to deal with those problems there before they come here. And that means we'll be sending more blood and treasure into further and further parts of the world. So we worry about climate change. We also worry about climate change from some very practical reasons. There's things like naval bases. The ports are starting to, as the water rises, it affects our ports. Can't use as many ports. Diego Garcia, which is one of the island bases that's way out in the South Pacific that we got during World War II. Places like Diego Garcia are sinking. You know, as the water's rising, take it either way. But this causes a lot of trouble, so there's very practical issues that our military is starting to think about with climate change. And then, of course, there's physical insecurity and cyber insecurity in the electrical grids. So if you aren't just thinking about the issue of the fuel choice, what we're actually using for the fuel, you can think about the actual physical issues going on. Of course, there's cyber. I know you all think a lot about this. You're working a lot with the grid and the smart grid. I was in China in January when Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, was there revealing that they had a stealth bomber and talking to them about this fact. And I was on what's called a Track 2 diplomatic mission, so with a group of people from Harvard, former government leaders, but all civilians, who were having conversations with Chinese government leaders, Chinese business leaders, and so on at the same time. And at some point, one of the people who was with us, who used to be the head of the National Intelligence Council, which is kind of the think tank for the CIA, or the whole intelligence community, actually, he said, look, I understand that you're trying to steal our state secrets, we're also trying to steal your state secrets. That's espionage. We get that. That happens. But you're also trying to steal all of our industrial secrets, and that's not cool. That's not allowed in the rules of the diplomatic game. So what can we do to get you to stop stealing all of our industrial secrets? Because this is causing us a real problem. And the interlocutors and the way things are in China, when you're at one of these government meetings or at the government guest house, everything was bugged. Every time I came back to my room, my cell phone would be turned on, and I'd taken the SIM card out, so back in America, so I wasn't using the cell phone. You know, everything is sort of being tested. Everything is scripted on the Chinese side. You're getting official government answers. And what the answer he got back was, look, that's a feature, not a bug. We're trying to take your secrets. That's the whole idea behind the way that we're operating in this world. They saw trade in a very mercantilist way. They saw trade very much as a zero-sum game rather than an all boats can grow or the pie can grow together, we'll move forward, which is how a lot of Americans see trade. They saw it as, look, you can come here, you can make money for a while. We'll let you make as much money as you can for a little bit, and then we'll learn what you do and we'll learn about how you do it, and then we'll kick you out and we'll have companies that do the same thing. That's the plan. That's worrisome for a lot of reasons, but it's worrisome particularly from an industrial perspective, our own competitiveness perspective, and for certain key industries such as your own, particularly the electricity and energy industries, it's worrisome from a national security perspective. The Wall Street Journal reported a couple years ago, in 2009, that the Chinese had been hacking and the Russians also had been hacking and testing these SCADA systems that are connected to the electricity grid. So all of these systems were not designed to be secure. They were designed to move electricity from one place to another. They were designed to be controlling systems. We didn't think about security when they were set up. And then they got connected to the internet when the internet came along. Again, not a lot of thought about security. It was more about how neat this was and how much more efficient it was. Well, all of a sudden, the Chinese and Russians have access to this. And it seems like they're probably testing it. Well, when I say this to people when I'm out in Colorado, they say, well, okay, so the Chinese can turn on my washer dryer. This doesn't really upset me that much. Maybe they will get things done more efficiently than I would. But what we worry about is things like a war with Taiwan, where the Chinese then turn out the lights on major military installations here. You know, what if they launch a war and then cause our systems to break down? Our entire military is hooked up to the electricity grid. It's a very important way that we function. And if we can't use it, if they have the ability to turn it on and off, well, boy, that's a problem for us. And so you're seeing responses trying to pull off and so on from the grid. I'm trying to watch my time here a little bit. You also have just the issue of a weak and old and overstressed grid. So natural disasters, things like the branch that fell on the Ohio station a number of years ago caused the Northeast power blackouts. It's another issue, physical insecurity. So how does DC respond? How does Washington respond to all of these energy challenges? Well, let's go back to those three tribes, the hacks, the wonks, and the troops. And we'll take the wonks first. The policy technocrats are looking at these problems and they say, well, how do we deal with these problems? And the policy technocrats tend to be divided up by agency. And so some people are just looking to sell, right? Department of Commerce, they're here to help you sell. Other departments, Department of State, Department of Defense, National Security Agency, they're here to protect, and they're just looking through that lens. There's not a lot of looking through multiple lenses, so you get a lot of regulation. That's what happens on your end. The electricity grid gets declared a critical infrastructure. It's been a critical infrastructure for a long time. That has a whole lot of repercussions, and suddenly there's more and more regulation saying, hey, this is a real problem. We're very worried about this. We need you to fix it because we policy people might have gone to fancy schools, but we don't have engineering background. We don't know how to solve it. All we know is that we're scared, this is a problem, and we need you to do something. And that also results in badly written regulations. Because when you're regulating something that you fundamentally don't understand that well on the technical end, you can get some really problematic regulation that it's very difficult to bridge. And so the need, particularly in the cyber sphere, to bridge this gap between those of you who have the technocratic background and those of us who have the policy background is particularly important. I was saying earlier to somebody that the The cybersphere, the way that it's being looked at in Washington, it's just like the sea, the air, the water, the earth. When the military looks at these, the sea is the navies, right? The earth is the armies, the air and space are the Air Force. Cyber is just a whole nother realm. And it's a realm where good things happen, commerce happens, industry happens, and it's a realm where bad things happen that need to be protected. And we're still wrapping our head around, what do we do in this realm? How do we protect it? What do we do about it? So that's how the policymakers are responding. Now, how do the military respond, the troops? Well, the military tends to be very pragmatic, and they have a whole lot of solutions, and they have a whole lot of money, so they can throw things at problems. So first the military started looking at, well, what are we actually paying for fuel? And instead of counting it at the wholesale price, they started looking at what they call the fully loaded cost of fuel, which is how much does it cost by the time it gets to the theater of war. And what they found, a man named Colonel Nolan started that. Colonel Dan Nolan, really smart guy, he knew how to push the bureaucracy to move. So they'd been counting oil based on their wholesale price. But when you get it into the theater, suddenly you get prices like $400 a gallon to get oil to Afghanistan. Well, gosh, suddenly now your pricing becomes much more thoughtful, how much you're actually spending. And then they started looking at the cost in human lives. And they realized that in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, for every 24 fuel convoys that went into those countries, one person died. So every 24 convoys, a soldier or Marine died. That's not a great ratio. And so they started saying, how do we reduce our fuel? How do we reduce consumption? And they looked at all sorts of things. They have all sorts of interesting procurement power there. And so they did everything from HVAC, efficiency moves. They started putting foam on the edges or all around installations in the desert because the foam kept down the HVAC costs, tremendously reduced the number of convoys that needed to go in. And if you think about these convoys, just to make it real, these are oil tankers, right? And they're snaked out through the desert to get into one place, or they're snaked out through Pakistan to get through one mountain pass, which is a bottleneck mountain pass. These are just sitting ducks. One of the most dangerous jobs in these countries is to be a truck driver. And so they start doing all of these HVAC improvements. They start looking at ways they can reduce fuel by biofuels, by looking at local fuels. They start looking at distributed generation of energy. They start looking at waste to energy production so they can use the waste from a forward operating base that's out in theater to burn it or to combust it in one way or another and create fuel so they don't have to drag it in. Lots and lots of innovation going on. With the pricing, they start looking at, gosh, can we use biofuels? Can we use synthetic fuels? What can we do so that we're not funding the enemy at the same time that we're trying to fight wars? They're trying to move away from oil for that reason as well. They're doing a lot of microgrid work. I know some of you are going on to a DoD microgrid conference, but they're really experimenting with microgrids. They're also experimenting with getting bases fully off-grid because they're worried about this ability of the Chinese. They're less worried about the Russians for a whole bunch of reasons that we could talk about, but they're worried about the Chinese being able to turn on and off the lights. So they're taking Nellis, they're trying to take various bases completely off-grid as an experiment. And then they're looking at things, because they're trying to do that, they're looking at renewable energy sources as well. So, okay, we want to take it off-grid. We know we need to firm, so they'll probably be using natural gas or something like that as a firming. But they're trying to look at renewables. So DARPA, which is the really amazing, innovative platform that lets them do very quick turnaround innovation. DARPA's developed solar panels that are 42% efficient. It's pretty good for a solar panel. So they're looking at things like that. Lots and lots of innovation going on in the military space. I think that's all of it. Oh, and then the Navy is also trying tidal harvesting. So they're looking at, can you harvest energy from the tide, which is pretty neat. Then how do politicians look at all this? Well, the first thing they look for is jobs, because right now everything is about jobs. And so you've got the military saying, let's not fuel our own threats, so let's move away from oil. Let's look for local sources of energy so that we stop paying $400 a gallon to get oil to theater. And let's start moving toward renewables and off-grid and other things here at home so that our enemies can't turn on and off our lights. Politicians are saying, where do we have industry here? Where can we build jobs? Who's buttering my bread? right? Those kinds of questions. And politicians should be thinking about jobs and about their major industries at home and about how to employ people. But what that means is politicians in the farm states, Democratic or Republican, are looking at ethanol, right? Simple, it's easy. Politicians in places like my home state are looking at oil and drilling. Same with Texas, Louisiana, places like that. Colorado, where I live now, solar power is now a bigger employer than oil and gas in Colorado. Just surpassed the oil and gas industry. So suddenly they're all about renewable energy. So you kind of have 1,000 flowers blooming in the political space. And there's some really direct reasons for that. And it's not necessarily ideological, much more fueled by geography, much more fueled by where they're sitting. You also have politicians who have to deal with a whole lot of issues, and they're making laws very, very quickly. They're making laws quickly in response to major events in the world. So you get things like the blackout in 2003, and you get a major law passed in 2005 that says secure the whole energy grid somehow. That kind of thing happens all the time. When Newt Gingrich came into power, the whole contract with America, one of the things he did to slim down government was he took the brains out of the House. He took all of the think tank parts that were in the House out of the House. The Senate still has some of them. But what that means is that they're working with very little information. You also have a political class that's working with very young staff. Has anyone here seen In the Loop? There's a movie about DC. So there's a scene in this movie, the British come over to America. It's about the Iraq War, and it's a comedy. It's made by this British comedian. And so the British come over here, and they're sent to have a briefing with the White House, and they sit down with this 23-year-old kid. And the character, who's based on a real character from the British government, who's very potty-mouthed, just starts cursing at this kid, so angry at sitting down with his 23-year-old when he's a very high-up person. Well, that's what happens in our government all the time, because the House actually does not have, particularly the House, does not have that much money for staff. And so they pay their staff $25,000 a year, $30,000 a year. Well, who's going to work for that? You get a lot of kids right out of college. Some of them are moonlighting at other places. We held our first conference and went to dinner, and we were talking about national security policy and all sorts of things, and the waiter was extremely attentive. And afterward, I thanked him. I said, you know, we're not that wealthy a group. I really appreciate that you were so attentive. I'd like to give you a big tip. And he said, oh, no, I'm a staffer on the Hill. I'm moonlighting here as a waiter, and I just really love this stuff. I was excited to be listening into your conference. So, you know, if you've got that, and that's who your brains are on the House side, this is not to denigrate them. They're often very smart kids, but they're covering a lot of issues, right? Your policymakers are voting on everything from how to regulate the financial world to electricity grid, cybersecurity, to the post office in their local area, to veterans benefits. I mean, the level of things they have to cover is immense. And so they turn to these kids to help them out. They can get a little bit of help from outside. Lobbyists give them a little bit of help. They get a little help from think tanks. But they really need your help to understand the issues better. They really need the help of technical people who are able to explain things to them, to understand what they're regulating. Because what they get is a cry for help. Some story comes out in the Wall Street Journal that says the Chinese are hacking the grid, and there's a cry for help. And all of a sudden, people are lobbying them, there's action, somebody needs to do something. Well, they're going to pass a law. And if that law isn't good, it's because they don't have the resources and the ability and the thinking to make it good. And so they need the help to do that. Because one thing you can be certain of is in this energy world that we're living in, there will be more law and there will be a lot more attention over time. This is an issue that isn't going away. Pakistan right now is having riots because their electricity grid keeps browning out. And Pakistan is very hot, even this time of year. It's over 100 degrees a lot of the time. You don't want brownouts with a lot of poor people where it's over 100 degrees and people are mad. That kind of thing is happening over there. Here, in this country, nobody wants another California-style brownout. Nobody wants to be governor of a state that's going through that. And so people are worried about that. And we see these threats that are coming down the pike, and we say, gosh, we have to move away from oil. It's pretty clear that that's a cause of our security threats. There's a great book out by an Israeli and an American here, Ann Corinne and Gal Left, called Turning Oil into Salt, that is all about taking a strategic commodity. Salt used to be a strategic commodity. Militaries would fight over salt because it was how you preserved food. And if you couldn't preserve food, your nation couldn't survive. And so there were lots of wars. The Brits fought wars over salt. Well, nobody even thinks about that anymore. You don't think about where your salt comes from. You still use salt. We'll still use oil. But there's a real push in the security community to make it less strategic, to make it matter a lot less. Meanwhile, there's a real push for renewables because of the climate change issue, because of all the security problems that are coming up around climate change, and also because of the availability now of natural gas. There will be there's another way to firm it, to firm the renewables that seems more acceptable to some of the environmental community and so on. So politicians are going to be able to move in that direction. So you're going to see the legislation moving in that direction. Of course, there are some people who are pushing it back and pulling it back. But if you would like it to move in that direction in a smart way, if you would like it to move in that direction in a way that you will be happy with in your industries, the more you're talking, the more you're explaining to Washington the realities of the magic you do. Because it really does look like pulling things out of a hat. The magic you do is pretty incomprehensible to those of us who are working on the geopolitics and that sort of thing every day. And the more you can explain that magic, the better that the government will be able to be for you, and hopefully the safer our future will be for all of us. So thank you. $15.
This may sound a bit like a complaint, but it's intended with good nature. This is a surprise to us. That I remember telling a Truman war vet in 2003 that oil is America's drug, Saudi Arabia's the drug lord, the people who are the terrorists are the communities that are affected by the drug lord's actions, and the best way to kill the drug lord is to attack his clients. That's 2003, and the Korean War vet was very offended that I said that, but here we are turning toward this. It's kind of like we've got a lost decade of action against here with 9/11 and today. Are we just waking up to this, or are you just kind of bringing us up to speed?
It's a little bit of both. So certainly some people have been banging this gong for a long time. You know, since the 70s, we've recognized that oil was a weapon being used against us. In 73, during the first oil embargo, the OPEC oil embargo, there were lots of articles about, my gosh, we're hostage to this economic weapon. And then oil went down, it was cheaper again, everyone forgot about it. You know, you've probably noticed how hard it is to get anything done in Washington, D.C. If anyone can drop an issue, they happily will. And so the issue sort of rises and falls, usually with gas prices, right? When gas prices are high, 2008, 1973, times like this, everyone here gets very worried, and they realize voters will care, and they start looking at these strategic issues. And at other times, it's hard to get things through Congress. Other parts of the government might be working on them, so the DOD will continue working. But the DOD also has to deal with congressional legislation. So my organization, we do some advocacy as well. We were just working because the Defense Department has been developing these biofuels, and some folks up on Capitol Hill, for more ideological reasons, wanted to get them to stop. Actually wanted to get them to not have to move toward renewables. There's legislation that says they have to move toward more renewables or toward synthetic fuels, and some folks on Capitol Hill wanted to stop that because it's become ideological. And so things that go up to Congress get gummed up. So it's not that it's such a surprise, but it's that it ebbs and flows in getting political attention for it. The other thing is, the way you put it was beautiful. You should come up to Capitol Hill and lobby sometime. That's beautiful metaphors being used very intelligently. But a lot of people have vested interests in the ways things are. And so you need lobbying groups, you need a push from different sides. Jim Woolsey, when he writes about this, says you need the security hawks, the tree huggers, the church groups who care about religious freedom in these countries, all these people to come together to get something through Congress. And that's probably what's going to have to happen.
Where they showed
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And a lot of it is not, and this does not fall in the technical sphere, this falls in the political sphere, right? When you look at the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which I now have read a book about on tape, when you look at that, it was held up for almost a decade by the slavery question, because Congress was fighting about whether the route would go through the North or the South. The Northerners did not want it to go through the South. It was a slave state area at that point. Everyone knew that we needed a transcontinental railroad, but it took a lot of ideological fighting to get to that point. And so that's what you've got in Congress right now. You've got technical solutions that you can move toward, and ideological fighting that's preventing them. Over here, and actually, if you could say where you're from or sort of where you're coming from, that'd be helpful.
Just want some comments on rogue groups and how you feel they might impact all this. Groups like Anonymous who might attack China or Russia or whatever. They've been pivotal in what happened in Egypt, etc. And how will they impact decisions?
I just finished an article actually that's going to come out in December on just how much the foreign policy world is changing and how hard it is for us to wrap our heads around it. For years and years, we focused on other countries, right? Foreign policy was all about country-to-country action. Now you have hyper-empowered individuals and groups who can organize over the internet for very, very little money, who can create bombs for very little money. They don't need a military-industrial base to create these things. They get the plans off the internet. They can communicate with one another by cell phones. They can set off bombs with cell phones. And suddenly you're in a whole new world of hyper-empowered individuals, hyper-empowered groups. Your threats can come from many different places. And what that means is the security job is very difficult because, for instance, cybersecurity, it can be very hard to prove who did it. It's hard to find out where it came from. There have been cyber wars now between Russia and Georgia and between Russia and Estonia. In Estonia, it looks like the person who did it was living in Estonia, and so it was hard to show that Russia was the cause, even though most people in the security community sort of figured Russia was the cause. But proving it is very difficult, and that makes it hard to retaliate based on the laws of war. You've got countries that are taking advantage of this. So China has invested heavily in cybersecurity as a state-based asymmetric threat against us. They see that we're an open society, they're a more closed society, this is something they can use against us. Russia has got a very different platform. They've been developing it in-house. They've got a Russian military cyber capacity, but they also have just a lot of really smart nationalistic hackers. And they've created this whole culture of kind of punk nationalistic hacker types who are hacking according to them, according to the hackers, they're hacking based on their own nationalism, their own patriotism for Russia. Now, is that true? Are they really being paid off? It's very hard to tell. It's hard to tell if they're what we call cat's paw organizations that have plausible deniability of separation from the government, but are in fact controlled by the government, or whether they really are rogue. Because, of course, we could have rogue groups here in America as well. All it takes is some smart people, some intelligent PCs. I mean, my laptop computer that fits in my purse is smarter than a 1960s supercomputer. So it doesn't take that much, and because it's hard to prove, and because governments are using this cat's paw ability to separate themselves out, it makes it very hard to stop. Now, the good news is that America's, at this point at least, probably the best in cybersecurity. We've invested the most, we probably have the best capabilities. But the fact that we're using it, and it's pretty clear now that with the Iran Stuxnet virus that we launched against their nuclear facilities, that had something to do with America and something to do with Israel. Exactly what it had to do with those two countries is highly classified and not known, but it probably had something to do with both of them. Now that cat's out of the bag, it opens up the doors for lots of people to use this. And there are no rules in this space. No rules at all. It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of areas now that don't have rules in them. For instance, if we use a drone to kill someone in another country, and that drone person using the drone is sitting in Nevada, in an Air Force base in Nevada, and then someone from that other country comes here and murders that drone user when he's going home to his family that night. Is that an act of war? Is that a crime, a typical murder? Very hard to know. Cyber is exactly the same thing. There's no rules.
Rachel, Bryce Barnes, Cisco Systems, managing architect for our manufacturing center of excellence. Quick question on the oil economy. Clearly, we've identified an oil economy here. There's a value chain that stretches all the way back to the Middle East and throughout the world. There are enormous economic beneficiaries here at home to the oil economy. How do we address the value chain from their benefit perspective? These are oil companies, these are agribusiness, these are all types of economic entities. Even the American consumer themselves is benefiting from what is really an indirect subsidy to energy through our military. How do we address the real problem at home and fundamentally change things so that it happens more naturally? It doesn't have to be a policy as much as it is an organic change.
It's a very, very smart question. I put most of my money and most of my thought in technological improvements. If you can make another source of energy cheaper, people are going to move to that other source of energy. And that's, first of all, probably the most likely way that this is going to happen, because regulation in government is going to be very slow, very problematic. And it's the best way for this to happen, because the people who use the most oil as individuals, I'm not now talking about industry, the individuals who use the most oil tend to be poorer people, right? When you're out in Nebraska, I was out in Nebraska at a ranch with a friend of mine who was running for Congress, and he was campaigning. Well, the nearest town to him was 60 miles away. That was 200 people. The nearest town with any real people was over an hour and a half away. A lot of people in rural states and the prairie states in the South are living in situations like that, so you really don't want a huge tax on oil because it's a very regressive tax. Also, for our industry, you don't want a huge tax on oil because, my gosh, we have enough problems with our economy without slowing down the very engines that are driving jobs. And so to me, the best thing to do is to put some money into R&D to make it as end-user blind as possible, to not favor one industry over another, but try to put it into basic R&D and move this along more quickly. Because ultimately, if we can find something cheaper than oil, people will move to that cheaper source. Now, there are vested interests that are pushing against some of this. There's some legislation now about open fuel standards and all sorts of things. And there are vested interests who really don't want to move away from oil. But I think the nice thing about the slowness of our policy process is that it lets everyone see the writing on the wall. So you now have oil companies and gas companies. They see the writing on the wall. They see where things are going. And they're starting to diversify their investments. Right? A lot of these companies are actually investment companies as much as they are anything else. And as they diversify their investments, if they're an oil company, they're also investing in biofuels, that kind of thing. They'll make money. They'll find a way to make money. The ones that are smart are getting on that bandwagon already. You come talk to me after. Boy, I wish I had a friendlier answer for you, because this is that is the $60 million question right there. One of our members of our Truman community who's in the finance industry trying to finance these projects was asking me something very similar a couple days ago. And this is the worry, because you're dealing with a government, and the government can change its mind. And the financing requires long-term investment. We're fighting right now. The military wanted to invest in Montana in some alternative fuels in Montana, and OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, was saying, well, you need to put the entire 30-year contract in the first year. That's one way to be sure that you'll get paid, right? Because it's all already budgeted. It's already on the books. It's also a way to be sure it will never happen, because when you look at 1 year cost of fuel versus 30 years cost of fuel, that's not going to cut it. Congress will cut that right away. So you have that tension right now. Obviously, we do have the rule of law here, and contracts are contracts, and even if government changes its policy, it tends to uphold contracts. So you have that comfort. You also have the comfort that government rarely removes something once it puts something in. Even if Republicans come in and don't like renewable fuels, I mean, we're still giving out peanut subsidies to farmers that were from the Great Depression, right? I mean, we don't really have a problem with peanuts in this country, but those farmers still get major subsidies. Same with cotton, same with all sorts of things. So if you can turn peanuts into fuel, then you've really got a business model. I'm being told that there's one more, but we can talk more afterward.
Oh. Hello. I just wondered if you would comment, since you said you were in China and having these discussions, what was talked about regarding rare earth materials?
Boy, it was only talked about a little bit in China, but I was talking yesterday with one of our Truman community members who works in the State Department and has been working on economic statecraft. Secretary Clinton just gave a series of 4 speeches where she's talking about the need for America to exercise economic statecraft, which we've never done, really. A lot of other countries see their economy as a strategic asset, and they use it in that way. America has been much more laissez-faire about it. Rare earth minerals are something that people who studied that field have almost for a decade been saying, hey, look at what's going on here. For those of you who don't know this area, rare earth minerals, first of all, have a really sexy name, which is useful for getting people's attention. But they're actually somewhat rare. We have them here in the United States, but we have EPA regulations against mining them. So we do have the ability to mine them here. They're used for everything. I mean, you know this more than I do, but most of our electronics are now requiring some rare earth minerals. China has cornered the market and turned off the spigot for a little while. And that was a big wake-up call. It was probably very poor statecraft on their part, because what it did was a lot of us had been beating the drum on this for a while, trying to get policymakers to realize that we needed to look at strategic commodities that other countries were investing sovereign wealth in. Because a lot of countries now have sovereign wealth funds. This is a fairly new thing. And they're investing strategically in assets around the world, both commodities and also businesses. And Silicon Valley has a whole industry of this, of other countries coming over to Silicon Valley. And we hadn't been making a lot of headway, frankly, with the political leaders. They were having a lot of trouble understanding what the problem was, because every country compares their model to other countries. It's very hard for political leaders in any country to not believe that other countries are like them. So when you go over to Pakistan, the media thinks that our media is just a mouthpiece for the government, because their media is a mouthpiece for the government, right? And so with rare earth minerals, we would say, look at what these sovereign wealth funds are doing, look at how they're investing, look at where they're cornering the market. And a lot of people on Capitol Hill would say, well, that's the market. They'll have an interest in selling to us. We're customers. Why would they cut it off? And they just weren't thinking strategically. The fact that China did cut it off meant that all of a sudden people realized, no, this is not just a market. This is a government that's choosing how to throw its weight around. And so now I think you're going to see change. You might see change here. You might see some of those EPA regulations relaxed, which would be the simplest way to deal with it. You might see us starting to invest financially. We don't have a sovereign wealth fund in America. There's talk about having a national infrastructure bank that might be allowed to invest. There's various things that can be done. There's also a push in the State Department to use more serious economic statecraft against China, not necessarily tariffs and kind of blunt instruments like that, but just being a little more serious about how we act towards their gestures of that sort. I think my time is up. Thank you.